one day I was walking through Waikiki and I found some discarded magazines that some British tourists had left. And they were apparently music magazines. I had no idea why these people had really long hair and weird clothes, because it was a very conservative period in America. We're talking 1965. Mm-hmm. And in that catalog of weird photos was a place you could send away from the Heener Record Center to buy albums from these rather strange looking people. So I sent away for them. And I had in Hawaii, before they were released in America, albums by The Who, Jimi Hendrix, the Rolling Stones, Yardbirds, Pretty Things. And I brought them to my high school, and I said to the teacher there, I said, can we play them on the PA during the lunch hour? Because they had really like terrible music. So we were playing them for all the students, and all these guitar players came to me and said, what is this? Where, you know, because everybody was listening to Dick Dale and the Beach Boys at this point. There was no heavy guitar. So I became suddenly very popular with a group of guitar players, but I aspired to play guitar, couldn't. And then I was almost shunned. And it was like, well, you're not an artist. You don't play guitar. Like, why are you hanging out with us? So I became a bit despondent. But then the Rolling Stones happened to come through Hawaii. And I snuck out and I went to the concert, 8,500 people screaming, flashbulbs going off. It just mesmerized me. And I said, whatever this is, I need to be part of this. So at 15, I became a travel agent, believe it or not. And I worked after school on weekends and outside scales. And after a year, I was allowed a free airline pass anywhere in the world, first class. I went to London, 1966. And it was right at the height of all of that. And I was around everything. And then they were making this movie Blow Up, which was about a photographer. And it had my favorite band in it, Jeff Beck, Jimmy Page, the Yardbirds. And you know, I was very aware that that was under production. The people I was staying with looked after the photographer studio. So a light bulb went off in my head. And I said, this I can do. I need to be a photographer. So I went back to Hawaii. I caddied for a year to buy camera equipment, you know, up at the Oahu Country Club, went down to the local camera store. And because David Hemmings used a Nikon in the movie Blow Up, I said, I cannot consider myself a photographer unless I own Nikon. So I bought my first Nikon camera, Francis camera, a couple of lenses, and I'm now like, okay, now what? How do I get to these big rock stars? I'm in Hawaii. And so the Vietnam War was raging. My parents were like, you know, worried I was going to be drafted. And I read that in the summer of '68, Bill Graham was going to book all of these bands at the Fillmore West that were the obsession that I had. So I convinced my parents I needed to go to San Francisco Art Institute. My classmate was Annie Leibovitz, and I spent very little time in school. I spent most of it down at the Fillmore. I befriended Bill Graham. He let me in before his concerts. I was right at the foot of the stage. My very first concert that I ever shot was Jeff Beck, Rod Stewart, Ronnie Wood on the Truth Tour. And it was a couple of nights. And so I brought photos down and everybody was blown away. And Jeff clued me that there was a band that Jimmy Page was going to do that was coming out. He said, it's going to blow your mind when you hear it. Didn't have a name yet, but I was aware of it. Mm-hmm. So in that summer of '68, I ended up shooting probably some of the most important work of my life. I mean, I worked with, you know, Jimi Hendrix, Santana, Jethro Tull, you know, just the whole gamut of all the top British artists down there. And that's more or less how I got into it. But when I went down to shoot Jimi Hendrix, there weren't backstage passes. There wasn't all this drama. I walked in, I had my camera, and I just started heading to the front of the stage. People saw the camera, they got out of my way. And I walked and I was at the bottom of the stage up there. I only shot 14 pictures. I was so blown away by Jimmy. I took 14 pictures and stopped shooting, and I was just standing there like, what am I witnessing? I mean, that was it. That was the beginning of it all.
That's amazing, because there's obviously, you and I talk about the changes in the industry with all the layers of the band's management and legals and all this stuff now. You know, there's all kinds of, you know, releases and protocols that you have to follow, and 3-song limits and things like that. And I think I remember you saying once, you know, back in the day, if you had a camera, it almost looked like you were with the band. Yeah. And, you know, that the access is totally different. Well, I don't want to waste another second, and I would love to start sharing some of these photos and start talking about these amazing stories. And you mentioned Jimi Hendrix, and your first picture in the body of work you've done is of Jimi. And I apologize for having to take the years and years and thousands of photos I see you post and whittle it down to a very small group. But
yeah.
Take off with Jimi Hendrix here again. Your love of the guitar, your passion for music. Here's Hendrix. I don't need to say anything else.
Well, this was 1968, Fillmore West, one of the 14 photos that I took, which years later, Jimi Hendrix used all 14 because they happened to be recording that concert that night. And I had the cover of this CD package, and they used every one of the photos I did that night, which was an insane arc, if you think about it, you know, that from 68 to now. But once you took that picture of Jimi Hendrix, you could show it to other people, and then they wanted to work with you. And I remember that was sort of the entree for me to meet a lot of other guitar players. And I was very tight with the promoter in Hawaii, Tom Moffitt, and I would call Tom and say, look, book this band, it's happening over here. So by the time Jimi Hendrix came to Hawaii in 1969, I was hanging out with him at the Diamond Head House and became friends with the band, and you just sort of had that interpersonal relationship when they came to town. So I shot Jimi many times, and you know, an amazing person. That's all I can say.
When you went in with that combination of camera and couple lenses and you started shooting shows, what were your focal lengths at that point?
Well, you know, the thing is, I didn't have a lot of money, so I didn't have a lot of lenses. So I probably only had, at this point, 2 to 3 lenses. So I probably had a 24 millimeter and a 135 and maybe a 50. And so I just had to make it work within the focal length of my lenses. And I've kind of stayed that way in the sense of being able to shoot rock concerts. It's like I really am comfortable with just a couple of lenses and then having to accommodate myself to those focal lengths to work with an artist, to get in close. Because the 24 requires you to really get in close, you know, in a live concert situation. So that's the way I sort of stayed and still shoot.
And of course, this is back in the film days of, what is it, maybe Tri-X or, you know, whatever, you know, films are out at the time.
We were really limited by the ISO back then. I think 400 was the top. And the labs didn't really come up with the idea of pushing film. And of course, because I was at the San Francisco Art Institute, I was doing my own darkroom work. I was doing my own printing. And then one day I was looking at the development time and it said, you know, whatever it was, 7 minutes or whatever. And I said, I wonder what happens if I did it for 14 minutes, you know? And I kind of came up with that. And I was even processing my own color film when I got back to Hawaii, because it took a week to get film from the mainland processed, and you didn't get that feedback like you do today. You know, you had to wait. So you either got the shot or you didn't get the shot, you know?
Yep. And that was a big challenge then. And, you know, days of manual focus, not autofocus. And, you know, the craft of photography, you know, included all of the different fundamentals that, you know, we still need today, but we're assisted by technologies. Does it at all, do you sit back and say to yourself, you know, you have now worked with, and we'll see even more pictures, some of the best people in the music business, some of the most noted people in the music business. Is there still that like emotional connection to all of this for you?
It is. And, you know, my passion now is discovering and photographing up and coming guitar players. I have a whole program where I mentor over 100 guitar players around the world, and I kind of try to help them connect with other people. I've actually got some of them signed to major bands, got them record contracts, but my focus is really to stay on guitar-centric pictures. I really like shooting guitar players, you know, and drummers subsequently as well.
And that program's called the Brotherhood of the Guitar, correct?
Yeah.
Beautiful, beautiful. And it's a great start to these images, because as we move along, again, I asked you this question before, as you know, from years past to current day, I see a lot of great recording artists, but, you know, will you ever have the epicness of a Jimi Hendrix or a Led Zeppelin or whatnot? We could talk about that as we move forward. But what is this picture? Where is this? Pan American Airlines?
This is so unbelievable. And the interesting thing is I got contacted last week by the Pan Am Museum asking if they could put this photo in the museum for Pan Am. But basically, after Jeff Beck had told me about this band that Jimmy Page had, I actually knew Jan Weiner, the editor of Rolling Stone, and I went in there one day and I begged him to send me to Los Angeles for the debut of this new band of Jimmy Page's at the Whiskey A Go-Go. And he reluctantly wrote me a letter and said, yeah, whatever, go down and do it. So I show up at the venue the day of the concert in LA, which was in January in 1969. And I went to the lady at the desk and she said, well, you can't get in here. You're not old enough. You had to be 21. And I said, well, look, I'm with Rolling Stone magazine. I need to shoot this band. You know, I made a big plea. So she picked up the phone and she called the hotel and got Jimmy Page on the phone and said, look, there's this photographer here from Rolling Stone. He's here to shoot the band. He's not old enough to get in. And Jimmy said, send him to the hotel. So I came over to the hotel, spent the entire day with Led Zeppelin, who had yet to play their real big debut show in, you know, Los Angeles. And they brought me in as road crew. And because they changed their name from the New Yardbirds to Led Zeppelin, it was a non sequitur right away, and nobody really knew who Led Zeppelin was. And Jimmy said they were opening for a girl band. So I was like, okay, whatever. So anyway, I came in with the band, shot these shots, became friends, went on to San Francisco with them, shot the next series of shows, got on the phone with Tom Moffat in Hawaii and other people and said, you have got to book this band. This is going to be the biggest band in the world. So Jimmy got on the phone, made a deal, and Zeppelin was headed to Hawaii. Well, when they showed up in Honolulu, the guy said, well, go out to the airport. They know you, so, you know, meet them. So I show up. You can see the days of no security. You could walk right up to the plane. And they happened to be carrying the master tapes of Led Zeppelin 2 in their arms.
Wow.
I didn't realize it at the time, you know.
Yeah.
You could see them. They had the master tapes. So I took this shot. I did a whole lot of other shots over at the Honolulu airport. And then we all went over to the house that they rented where Jimi Hendrix had stayed. And we went surfing, we went swimming. I took them down to the local FM radio station, which was a big deal than FM, right? Woo! And we hung out and became friends. Now, Jimmy has blogged this photo several times on the day I took it, which I think was like May 10th. And he often talks about the importance of this photo, the master tapes that they're carrying, and why each of them had a set of it in case they lost it, you see. So, very epic shot. And subsequently, over the years, there were other photographers that shot the band in front of airplanes, but this was 6 or 7 years before anybody else had done that. You know?
And that's pretty amazing. And you certainly, obviously, in your, you know, your love of music and your understanding of it, you kind of knew these guys were big, but did you ever think they would endure as Led Zeppelin as long as they have, as historical as they have?
Well, I think no one had any expectations then, because if you lived to be 30, people thought that was old. So no one would think of anything epic at the time. And Jimi Hendrix was having problems because, you know, he was African-American playing with white guys during a period of uproar. And, you know, he had protesters outside some of his shows. But it was a very violent but yet wonderful time in America for music. But, you know, we had riots going on. We had pandemics at the time, the Hong Kong flu. So I've kind of been through it before.
You're a veteran. Beautiful. And here we go. More history. Yeah. You photographed a lot of these artists when they were really young. And, you know, talk about this picture, but I also want you to speak to the nature of the relationships you have, because I know you have great relationships with a lot of the artists, and talk about the importance for anybody tuning in that wants to connect with a band and do that kind of stuff. But we have the Rolling Stones here.
Again, this is very ironic because, you know, I had that relationship with Jan Weiner, and the Stones were coming to Hawaii, and I got a call from Rolling Stone magazine and said, we want to book you for 5 days to photograph the Rolling Stones in Hawaii, sailing and everything, because Annie Leibovitz can't make it. So I'm like, oh my God, so this is going to be the breakthrough point of my career right here, boy. And 2 days before the concert, I get a call saying, well, Annie can make it now, sorry. So they canceled my being the one shooting it. But because I knew the promoter and I knew everybody in Hawaii, they allowed me to shoot the shows. And when I was backstage, I was instructed under no circumstances was I to go into the dressing room. Okay, fine, I won't go in the dressing room. Bill Graham was the promoter as well as the local promoter. And suddenly I was backstage with not backstage, but I was behind the venue, and Bill Graham saw me with my camera bags and said to me, what are you doing? Get into the dressing room. I told you to stay in the dressing room. I'm like, okay. So now I'm in the dressing room, and I'm there with Keith Richards alone. And he's doing all his crazy stuff. He has a knife on the table and some Jack Daniels, and he's sitting there and he's smoking. And he sees my camera bag, and I sit down next to him, and he kind of looks at me like, don't even think about taking that camera out of the bag. So that's when I first met them. The irony was one of the shots that I took that night in Honolulu was used in the 50th anniversary of the Rolling Stones, 2 pages wide in their book. So full circle. But over the years, I've interacted with the Stones. Ronnie Wood became a really good friend. He wrote the foreword to my Slash book, which was hysterical. I've worked with Ronnie since Jeff Beck, Rod Stewart, the Stones. And then, you know, he and I would show art together because he has tremendous painting. He painted one of my Stevie Ray Vaughan images and then gave me one of the lithographs. I'm very proud of that, but it's one of my favorite bands. That's why I'm a photographer.
Well, you know, you bring up a couple of things I think are still so important today. Is one, respecting the stage, respecting the backstage, you know, listening to the rules, because that's what's going to get you further along. But now speak to those relationships that you have and how important they are to you.
Well, I think you know, in my career, relationships that I had 40, 50 years ago are still valid. Like one of the amazing artists that my wife and I work with is Neil Schon and Journey. And I actually shot the first Journey concert, which was in Hawaii, and they were all part of the Santana band. And then they kind of made a little band with Greg Rowley, and they opened for Santana. And I think Neil was 15 or 16 years old. And, you know, I still have those relationships, still have those friendships. And, you know, Carlos is a really good friend. My wife, Marianne, works a lot with Carlos Santana. And these guys are our friends, you know, when we see each other, it's like an old friend, you know. And so you don't exploit, you don't let weird pictures get out, and you respect them. And always remember that they're the star. The photographer's not the star. The photographer's there to make the artist look good. The artist is not there to make the photographer look good. That's how I look at it.
I think that's so important, because that is how you get asked to come back again. And I've seen actually some artists that will shut down photographers if someone shares a really bad picture of them. Sure. You know, it is a pride. Nobody likes a bad picture thrown out there, but these are incredibly well.
Rod Stewart and Ronnie Wood. Some zany times with these guys. Yeah,
and I'm sorry if I freeze up there every once in a while, right. But welcome to the internet and the live broadcast. But I was saying, I don't know if you heard me, but how many of these artists are still performing right now, because I photographed them.
Everyone's making the largest amount of concert sales. I mean, I think Journey and Def Leppard set a record, 1 million tickets. I mean, people want to hear this kind of music. There's a sort of overproduction of music nowadays. It's more about the production than it is the music. And I think when you get a band that's just so great that, you know, you don't need all the fireworks and all the strange things. I mean, you know, I'd rather see Aerosmith in a small venue like they're playing in Hawaii than a massive coliseum. You know, and these guys were unbelievable. I mean, I worked with Faces. I worked with Rod Stewart. I worked with Jeff Beck, with Rod and Ronnie. So I had a friendship there. And when they came to Hawaii, Rod would call me and say, you know, hey, can you give us some tips? Can we hang out? And I remember this particular deal. The night before I took this picture, Rod checked into the Kahala Hilton, and he was staying there. And Helen Reddy, I don't know if anybody ever remembers Helen Reddy, but she suddenly showed up with her husband, and she wanted the room that Rod was in. So the manager asked if Rod would be willing to move his room, and he said no. He wasn't. And of course, Helen Reddy flipped out, and the husband flipped out, and there was a huge uproar. So finally the manager said, look, I'll give you a bigger room, whatever it takes. So Rod trashed the room completely, shoved washcloths down the toilet, just completely destroyed the room, and then left the room and moved to the other room. Well, down in the lobby, you know, Helen Reddy's husband confronted Rod. There was a huge uproar, and Rod grabbed the painting of Baron Hilton off the wall and put it over the top of his head. So, I mean, it was just this fantastic uproar. And that hotel had become the scene of quite a wild bunch of things going on. But that night at dinner, Rod Stewart ordered a bottle of Lafite Rothschild, and he said, watch this. So the guy brought the big ceremonial presentation of this expensive wine. Rod tastes it, says it's terrible, 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 send it back. So the guy freaks out, goes and gets another bottle, opens it, Rod tastes it and says, great, this is much better. Now bring me some ice. And the guy just completely flipped. But Rod, great prankster,
When you shot this image, it looks like a 24 millimeter. Are we shooting on the wide side here?
Yep.
And when you're shooting, what tips would you throw out there in the way of sort of making these pictures on the fly? We always talk about the incredible pictures being behind the scenes where nobody's seeing, a lot of this out in front, but on the stage, it's a bit different.
Well, I kind of like the idea of shooting without a lens hood because I like the flare, and I honestly would try to set up shots. And through my career, I've got quite a few iconic pictures with a similar background of the light flaring across the frame. I just love it because it's just, and so I tended to take off the lens hoods or not use them and really play with the light a lot. I really enjoyed it. And since I knew the music, you could set up dramatic moments. You knew what was coming, so you could get yourself in position. So I enjoy, and for me, it's just this amazing process of interacting with the music and taking the picture.
I think it's fascinating. A lot of times when I speak about rock and roll and photography, of course the band is epic, the music is epic, the people behind you screaming is epic. But, when you have to think about the lighting, if you have a great show at Sweet Light, you find that lighting director and you kiss them on the lips because they help elevate, what you're trying to do. Of course, back in the black and white days, not a lot of color film options. I love the tonality of black and white. So, really appreciate this picture as we move forward. A lot of stars in this picture. What's going on?
This is unbelievable. And my friend Kevin Mazur, I don't think was happy about this photo, but Guitar Center and Dave Waterman and I, we would host the green room at the Grammys in Los Angeles. And this was our green room. And we would have artists come and go. And Bono came over and wanted to use the green room to rehearse a song for tsunami relief or something like this. I can't remember what was going on, but it was an epic thing. And we said, yeah, as long as I can stay in a room and take pictures. So suddenly all of these rock stars show up. I mean, it was just astonishing. And they all let me photograph them. And in different combinations, I did pictures with Steven Tyler and Billy Joe Armstrong from Green Day and Matt Sorum. But it was one of the more epic setups. But it's like this photo, it was just retarded. Kevin was running around shooting something else with the official photographer for the Grammys. And Getty had an exclusive. Well, I'm a Getty photographer, but still, I had never been allowed to come back stage and shoot at the Grammys since this photo.
Yeah, Kevin is a pretty epic photographer. And
I love Kevin. We're good friends, but still, it's very friendly competition.
Yeah, one of the things I love about all of this, and working with you and Lynn Goldsmith and some of my favorite people in this business, I've learned so much. But you look around, you got Steven Tyler's kind of in the background there, and you got a few things going on here. So,
Bono, you got Cowboys, you got Tim McGraw there. I
was gonna say, you got Tim McGraw. Is that Slash in there with the London shirt?
Yeah, Slash and Scott Weiland and
Wilson,
Alison Krauss and. There's some amazing people here.
Yeah. As I stare at my computer, and I should be staring at you. Very, very cool. So as we roll on, speaking of Slash, I know you've got a great relationship with Slash, another guitarist. I'll still look at you as a guitarist, whether you think you could play or not. I know you've done a couple of books with Slash as well. At least he's been on several covers of yours too. But talk about the relationship here and what this picture is all about.
Well, it's very interesting because I knew Slash from the very early days because I got hired by a guitar company to photograph him while they were down doing one of the Guns N' Roses album at A&M Studios. And right from the get-go, he was different than any rock star I'd ever met because he came out and carried my equipment into the studio. He's also one of the strongest guys I know. When you shake his hand, he can tear your arm off. But I just was blown away that he took the time to help me carry my equipment into the studio. So we became friends at that point, and the funny thing is, to this day, I've yet to meet Axl Rose, and yet I've been around all of this, and I started to photograph Slash during different epochs of his career, Snake Pit, and all these different bands, Velvet Revolver, and we really developed a really good friendship with each other. So when the documentary was being done, Rock Prophecies, I really wanted Slash to be in it, and I really wanted something important the way we did it. So I said to Slash, come up with an idea. Well, his idea was we would break into his own high school and we would drive his, Austin Martin down through the hallways, and then I would interview him sitting at the steps of where he did his first concert, where he performed for the first time. So we were there, we did this, we broke into the school, security descended on us, and it was a big uproar. He took off because he didn't really want to get into trouble. And then I was trying to explain to security, I said, look, I'm doing this important thing, it's a big rock star. And the guy said to me, come with me. He took me to the front of the school, and there was a neon sign that said, Slash, please call home, please call home. Red Hot Chili Peppers, please call home. So he said to me, if you can get Slash to play the Alumni Association, you guys could keep shooting. So I called Slash on the phone. I said, look, whatever I say, just say yes. So he came back. I introduced him to the security, and they said, hey, man, we really want you to play this alumni thing. And he said, yeah, fine, no problem. And so they let us shoot, and then when they left, he said to me, screw this, they threw me out of this school. So I threw a desk at a teacher, they made me leave. But he was sitting on the steps of where his first concert was as a little band, and he was playing his acoustic guitar, and I was being filming him, and he was so still that he managed to keep the ash on this on the cigarette, right down to the filter, and he just was so at peace with himself playing. And so I just love this shot,
Talk a little bit about Rock Prophecies. What was the concept behind that? Why did you create that documentary?
Well, it was reluctantly created because originally some friends of mine were going to do a reality show on Ronnie Wood. That was their concept. They pitched it to the producer of Will and Grace and Seinfeld, and he liked the idea. But since they didn't know Ronnie Wood, they asked if these guys knew anybody that knew Ronnie Wood. They had me come down and sort of try to pitch it to this producer. Well, I basically pitched him not to do it because I said, look, you're not going to get the Stones. You're not going to get the music. He's going through personal issues in his life that probably Mick Jagger wouldn't want on camera. So he sort of lost the idea of doing this Ronnie Wood reality show. But then he said, well, what do you do? And I said, well, I'm a photographer. He says, well, what did you do? And I said, well, I was one of the first guys to, work with, Jeff Beck and Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin America. I was the last guy to work with Stevie Ray Vaughan. He said, let's do a reality show on you. And I said, forget that. I don't want anything to do with a reality show. He said, well, what would you be willing to do? And I said, well, what about if we do a documentary and I give back to the people that allowed me to photograph them? So he said, great. Who can you get? I just said, well, who do you want? So he said, well, who's the hardest person to get? I said, probably Jeff Beck, because he's very reclusive and he doesn't do this sort of thing. He said, can you get him? And I said, hold on. And I called Jeff on the phone. I said, Jeff, they want to do a documentary of my life. And he said, can I be in it? So once you get Jeff Beck, the others follow. So I had invited all my friends to be part of it. So Santana's in it, Slash is in it, Billy Gibbons, Def Leppard. And then they wanted me to introduce new talent that nobody knew about. Like I used to go and work with these bands like Led Zeppelin. So that was sort of the premise of it. So then I was able to bring Sick Puppies into the picture, Tyler Bryant, an Irish band, and it all really worked well. And we won a few film festivals. And it was how the Brotherhood became born, because I started getting people reaching out saying, can you help me like you helped Tyler Bryant? And so I created this platform for young guitar players.
I really implore you, people tuning in, to if you haven't seen Rock Prophecies, it's a great documentary, and there's a lot of great information in there about the rock business and artists. And you mentioned Stevie Ray Vaughan, and I know this is a deep story for you, being that you were the last person to photograph Stevie Ray. How does this all unfold? You go into a concert that night. Tell the story behind this image and what happened that epic evening.
Well, it was ironic because in 1989, I get a call from Jeff Beck that he's going to go on tour with Stevie Ray Vaughan, who was an artist I really liked but never had met. So I flew back to Minneapolis. They were rehearsing at Paisley Park, Prince's place, and I became friends with Stevie. And I did quite a few dates on that Stevie Ray Vaughan Jeff Beck tour in '89. Stevie and I became friends, and I was probably the only person he ever met that was around the music business that had never done any drugs at all. And he used to come to LA and talk to me about his sobriety and how did I manage to be around all these people and not get stoned. And we developed a really interesting relationship. And in 1990, I get this phone call from, saying, I want you to be the photographer to shoot a poster for Fender of me, Eric Clapton, Robert Cray, and my brother Jimmy. So I flew back to Wisconsin. It was a 2-day concert. And we were supposed to do this the first day, and Eric forgot about it, had come in right before the gig and said, look, Robert, don't shoot tonight. We'll let the press photographer shoot tonight. You can have tomorrow, and you'll be the only guy, and we'll do the photo shoot first. So, very cool. So I spent the day with Stevie, and then the next day we did the epic photo shoot. Then I shot Stevie and the band. We carried on. We had a lot of fun. And then Stevie had some really weird premonitions, and we talked about those premonitions. And so he played, and we did this amazing encore. There's a whole lot of backstory on it that I don't really want to go into, but basically Eric Clapton or somebody said, look, we got an extra space on one of the helicopters. Do anybody want to go back to Chicago early? Because Stevie was in a tour bus. And Stevie said, yeah, I'll go. Robert, you want to go? I'm like, I don't want to go. We'll go see Buddy Guy play. And I'm like, no, it's all right. And basically he said to me, if anything ever happens to me, you'll know me when you hear me. And he gave me instructions of how to get out of that venue without going on the motorway back to Milwaukee. And in the morning when I woke up, I discovered that he had died and that I had the last photos of Stevie Ray in concert. Nobody else was shooting that night. And then Paul Natkin, who's the rock star photographer in the Chicago area, called me and said, everybody wants these pictures. Everybody thought he had them. And he said, no. And I was upset because Stevie was my friend. And for 2 years, I sat on these photos. So what became one of the coolest photo shoots I've ever done turned out also to be one of the saddest. So the irony is there.
Yeah, and I'm sorry for bringing up this past, but
no, it's like this music lives on, man.
Yeah, talk about the fact that you sat on these pictures for 2 years. I think that's really important that you didn't release any of the photos when people were begging for them.
Actually, somebody almost threatened me saying, you got to let these out. You'll think about what it'll do for your career. And I said, look, I have a career. I'm not worried about it. It's blood money, Yeah.
And did his family, his brother appreciate not sharing those images? I mean, that you weren't.
I never really heard about that from him, but Eric Clapton was very happy that I didn't rush out and do it. And when we first released the photos after 2 years, we did 200 of them through Fender. And I think they sold them and raised money for the Stevie Ray Vaughan Foundation, and Stevie's manager, Alex Hodges, and his PR people, they were all positive about these pictures coming out. And they'd all said, Stevie would want you to let them out. So I did.
I think it's important too, and I want to touch upon this while we're still here, that trust that you build up with these people. We talked about making great pictures of them. That's a no-brainer. I mean, you put a bad picture out there of, someone who looks contorted and doesn't look good. It's not a great thing to do. But talk again about the trust factor with all of this and dig a little bit deeper there, how important that is in the business that you're in.
Well, I think there's a tendency because of the time we live in, of the pop culture and the paparazzi, and these exploitive photos make a lot of money for photographers. If you can get a terrible picture of, an artist having a breakdown publicly or some indiscretion where they're, sunbathing without a top on or whatever it is, these things pay huge money. So there is this sort of almost herd mentality of the paparazzi photographers to stalk these artists and to get these kind of photos. And I think when the artists see you as, a fine art photographer or something on that level, but not an exploitive type of guy, they'll give you that access and they let their guard down. And when you see something or you photograph something that maybe they don't want out and you don't let it out, they appreciate that. It's an unspoken sort of thing. You must have the respect of the artist and their privacy. And it's a mutual thing. We're there to help each other, right? They can't really exist without the press, but at the same time, they try to limit the press. So I'm just, that's the kind of the way I am as a photographer. I'm not trying to tell anybody else how to shoot, but
No, and I think that's understood. And I think it's a great thing to develop the trust and relationships, as it's what you've taught me. And, when you realize that they are just very talented musicians, they are people. Again, one day you're shooting Stevie Ray and sadly the next day he's gone. The title of your book, or one of your books, I know you have several books, is called Rock Gods. And I think the world sees the performing artists that they love to go see in concert as gods, and they're people. And I think
they
once
were
I
more
started,
revered. I think they're more revered than politicians. I mean, you talk about Nelson Mandela. So much political pressure was put on South Africa. I honestly think Bono had a lot more to do with it, because every night he would call George Bush. He would put the power of his stardom behind these different causes. And I think Sting put a lot of effort on the Amazonian rainforest. And I think in a way they're more important than politicians.
Yeah, amazing. Again, thank you for sharing that story about Stevie Ray. I know it's very, very, very close to you. You had a great relationship with the guys from Aerosmith. Talk a little bit about Steve and Tyler.
Relationship, that spans a very long time. A friend of mine in Hawaii was a DJ, and he was on the best FM radio station, and I would bring him these records, and he'd be playing them on the radio before anybody, and he would, so the first Aerosmith had Train Kept a Rollin' on it, which was, again, a Yardbird classic song with Jeff Beck and Jimmy Page. He would play that and play that and play that. And the Aerosmith developed this huge following in Hawaii, and Tom Moffat, the promoter, brought them to Hawaii in '74, I think it was, and they were so excited. I mean, Steven Tyler came over to my house for breakfast. He got into my Corvette. We drove around Honolulu, took pictures in the studio. So we had this long-term relationship. But, years went by before I photographed them again. And then a few years ago, they hired me to be the tour photographer exclusively, and I was out on the road with Aerosmith for some really cool shows. And the very first night, backstage, before my very first, shooting Aerosmith in the current period, somebody, one of the band guys said to me, "Steven wants you to jump on the thrust during the song, on the second or third song. He wants you to jump up and be on this thrust that went out of the audience with him. But you got to go talk to him real quick, make sure it's okay." So then I go over to Steven's dressing room, and I said, "I think we've known each other a long time." He said, "Oh, so I hear, yeah." I said, "Well, the boys told me you want me to jump on the thrust. Is that okay?" And he said, "I'll get back to you." So I'm like, does he remember me? I'm completely like, what's going on with Steven? And so right before the show, the lights go down, and then they said, "Steven doesn't like your T-shirt. He wants you to change your T-shirt before he'll come out." So I'm like, what? So anyway, they gave me an Aerosmith shirt to wear. And I didn't know whether I could jump up on the stage or not. And I did jump on the stage, stood right in front of him, took these pictures, and then he took the mic stand and tried to hit me. He started chasing me around, trying to hit me with this mic stand, which I'm like, oh my God, this is really crazy. So then at the end of the song, he helped me into the bottom of the pit there, and then introduced me to the audience and said, "This is one of the great, rock photographers around." And so he completely punked me. I mean, just completely punked me that night.
That's an amazing story.
Yeah.
And how do you feel? I mean, you grew up with these guys essentially. Again, look at the ages of when you first photographed some of these bands to now. That's got to be very special to have that same relationship. I mean, again, they meet a million people, so it's no wonder that maybe one day they recognize you and the next day they don't. But the relationships over time, has that been something very special to you?
Yeah, and you're never sure if it continues, So just before we came down to New Zealand, my wife and I got invited to their unbelievable show in Las Vegas. They're playing a very small venue, and, epic show, epic lighting. And we were invited to see the band before the show, which is really not usually the case. They don't want people coming into the dressing room before a show. And we were backstage, and Steven was going on, and all of a sudden he goes, "I know you," and he came over, and we had like this amazing conversation about what he's doing for this charity called Jamie's House. And then we started having a conversation with Joe Perry, and then Brad Whitford came out, and he kept going, "Where have you been? Where have you been?" So, but yeah, we're still friends, and when we see each other, it's great. But they've got photographers now that they work with. I think there's two. A family member that actually shoots them a lot. So it's an on again, off again thing shooting them, but we always stay friends,
It's funny because you have to have a different mentality. I always tell people that want to get into rock and roll photography, you got to be thick skinned. and the
Yeah.
rules change on a dime. Your shooting positions change on a dime. You could know somebody or be really close with a band member, yet someone on security is going to tell you where to stand, that even if you had permissions, they change their permissions. You just have to be thick-skinned, and you kind of have to roll with it. But again, it goes back to respecting their environment, and if you respect it, you bring it back. You were my link into working with Steve Smith, formerly of Journey, and Dean Castronova. But the one thing you want to hear from the stage or the tour manager is thank you for respecting the area, because they feel safe with you. Then you're freer to kind of move where you want to go. But play the rules, play by the rules, and I think that takes you so much further. Now, you mentioned this gentleman a number of times. I know you've got an extraordinary relationship with him. Talk about this photo.
Well, Jeff Beck was the first guitar player that I really stood out in my mind, and I've always been like this mega fan. And I'd worked with him over almost a 50-year period, and he's played many shows in the 70s in Hawaii. I hung out with him in Hawaii, and we became really good friends in the 80s when suddenly he started to come out during this dreadful period of the disco era, and the whole rock thing sort of just went away. And Jeff came to Los Angeles to shoot a video for People Get Ready, this unbelievable song he did with Rod Stewart. And this was shot all over Southern California. And Jeff used to leave this 32 Ford at my house in LA. And then whenever he would come to LA, I'd pick him up at the airport. He would drive me home, and then he'd have a car to drive. And then when he'd go back to London, he would pick me up, and then I'd drop him back at the airport. So this particular day, we drove out to the Mojave Desert looking for locations to do People Get Ready. And my buddy Seymour Duncan was wanting to do an ad for his pickup company. And so we sort of found this amazing place, parked Jeff's car, and we just, got these shots. And there's a whole huge funny backstory on the guitar. But afterward, Jeff started looking around in the sand behind where we were shooting, and he actually found car parts for 32 Fords laying around in the desert debris. But years later, I got a phone call from some guy that said, I bought Jeff Beck's guitar from your photo. I want to buy a copy of this photo. He said that, this is a very expensive guitar and I want proof. And I said, I don't think you got what you think you got. And I said, why? I said, that's not Jeff Beck's guitar. I borrowed it for Seymour Duncan. It was a parts guitar. And the guy completely flipped out that he paid like $100,000 for this guitar. But Jeff does own a Nocaster, which is a very, rare 51 or 52 Telecaster.
Mm-hmm. And you still work with Jeff today?
Yeah, off and on, over the years. I mean, I worked with him just a couple of years ago in Vegas when he came through, and he's out with Johnny Depp. They're doing an album together right now, and they put out a song called Isolation, which is amazing for this period of time that the world is isolating. And it's an old John Lennon song, which is just extraordinary. And I met Johnny Depp very early in his career. And then just before we came down here to New Zealand, we photographed him in Los Angeles. He came out and played with, I forgot who it was. I think it might have been one of the major bands, Queens of the Stone Age. So, I mean, it was amazing. And pretty good guitar player and singer.
Well, these are some pretty epic, incredible pictures. But we fast forward a little bit to what you're doing these days with some of the new artists. Who is this? It's a beautiful picture.
This is Jacob Reese Thornton. And this was somebody I met when he was 14 years old. And there was something about him that was very similar to Tyler Bryant. He was an extraordinarily bright, amazing guitar player that could sing and write at such an incredible age. And so what I did is he and his father and I sat down and we figured out how to put a band together around him. Mm-hmm. I found him a manager. I've got him with producers. Mm-hmm. I got him booked at Eric Clapton's Crossroads. He played a private party before the Crossroads for all the people. He played at Crossroads. And I probably have done 5,000 or 6,000 photos of him over the last 3 years, shooting him all over the place. And I just think he's one of those breakthrough artists you'll be hearing about. He's 17 now, and just the music that's coming out during this time of isolation is unbelievable. He's got a new song called Ground Rush, which really relates to kids and what's happening to them right now on the planet. So I just think this is one of the guys to watch. There's quite a few of them, but this one is particularly different. I just really think he could go all the way.
So talk a little bit as we start to wind this down. you know, the transition from when you started to what you're dealing with today. I know you're still shooting actively every day.
Yeah.
You're shooting alongside Marianne. We see her every time you talk because her name comes up, because you must be on her computer. But you guys work together as a team, right? And you do so much with so many bands, you know, on commission and for them and on assignment. Yeah. What's changed? What's the biggest dramatic change from when you started to now?
Well, obviously the regulations, but how Marianne and I work with is like with Journey, we'll go in as 2 photographers, or when we're shooting Def Leppard, we go in as 2 photographers, but we literally have 2 separate careers. She has her own business, and she has just done phenomenal work with Carlos Santana, his wife Cindy, with the Go-Go's, just some extraordinary artists. And she is completely the opposite of me. She is very methodical, and it's all about, you know, the fine detail and the lighting. But the structures are today so restrictive in terms of like contracts and limitations and everything, but yet we have this almost loose relationship that isn't contract bound, and we feel very fortunate. It's just a word of mouth that we have with Neil Schon, that he owns these pictures, he can do what he wants with them. You know what I mean? It's a nice thing left over from the old days, but it's pretty epic now of restrictions, and I think it's getting worse. I get a lot of emails from young photographers saying, can you help me shoot the Rolling Stones? And I'm like, that's not going to happen unless you're working for a magazine or a publication. Maybe you got a shot at it, but just, you know, to show up, take pictures and try to sell them, I don't think you're going to get off on that. My advice is to find someone like Jacob Thornton, ride the rocket ship with them, help them, and then they never forget. I mean, I'm still see Robert Plant and John Paul Jones, and we have breakfast together and we talk about it. I mean, it's just, that's the fun for me, is these relationships that span 50 years.
Let me unshare the screen so I can bring you back. I'll call you Robert, Marianne, Billum. But you know, this is pretty epic. And again, I started off by saying this, and I truly mean it. You know, to be able to talk with one of your mentors about their careers, it's just an amazing thing for me. I think about you and I working together a number of times when we did South by Southwest. I know that was canceled this year, but that music festival in Austin, you know, where we saw Ed Sheeran before he was really Ed Sheeran. Remember, he broke like 6 of his strings on the guitar, and you know, made some really good contacts with a lot of other epic artists during that show. But it's always been a pleasure, and I can't thank you enough for sharing some of these stories. Any tips outside of what we talked about? If anybody's thinking about getting into performance arts, you just said it, you know, start with younger artists that may not be so prominent, not layered with all kinds of legal that you can work with. Any other thoughts behind that?
Yeah, I'd say, you know, don't get obsessed with shooting the live show, because every photographer that's anybody in every city is shooting that live show, and they're all getting the same dang shot. To me, the shots that are classic, the ones that endure, are those offstage moments, behind the stage, behind the scenes, and you know, something that the other guys don't get. So really the key today is access, and not your technical ability. It's the access, and to gain that access is really one that's based on trust, staying within the rules, and you know, that sort of thing. And that, I think that's the most important thing. To gain that access, you just need to develop that kind of friendship and that kind of respect that's mutual, and not try to exploit the artist. You know, I mean, it was very funny. I did a photo shoot one time with Bonnie Raitt and Buddy Guy, and Bonnie turned to Buddy and said, you know, they make money off these pictures. The photographer makes money off these pictures. And Buddy goes, so? I mean, you know, so he could care less. She was like, you know, worried about it, you know, and so you got to respect that.
Well, some great words to live by, great tips. I'd throw on top of that, respect the security guards around you for the venue and for the band, because they're the ones that are going to help access, and they're going to have your back when things may get a little crazy and out of hand. I remember losing a remote trigger at the venue I shoot at here at Jones Beach when I was doing some drum remotes. Yours. And so that kind of respect is just so important. Anyway, I can't thank you enough for your time. Great stories, great images. You and I are going to be doing this a little bit. Sorry I froze there a couple of times coming out. But this is the whole live broadcast thing, and we just roll with it. So thank you for your time. Much love to you and Marianne, and please still stay safe there. You know, who knows when we're going to be completely free of all this, but I assume you'll come back to the States at some point.
Yeah, right now I can't. It's like impossible. And I'm going back to where I started as a photographer, shooting landscapes and shooting beautiful wildlife. So I'm enjoying my time here. It's not wasted.
Well, I know you've done some articles on Learn and Explore. You got some new stuff coming up with us too. So again, thank you for your time, and thank you for the insight and sharing some of these deep stories.
All right, man. A lot of respect to you, man. I love your work.
Thank you. And those of you tuning in, again, thank you for tuning into this really cool episode of the Creator's Hour with Robert Knight. We went through some of his most epic pictures and great stories behind them. Check out NikonUSA.com/Creators Hour for other content. We've got challenges online. We've got 2-minute drills from ambassadors and photographers to teach you a little bit about what you can do during these times. And as we break free of this pandemic, we will get back to shooting and being creative. So we hope this time with you has inspired you to think about performance arts or rock and roll photography and working within this genre of photography. So thank you guys for tuning in. For Nikon, I am Mike Corrado. Please be safe out there, and we'll see you soon.